Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Melissa Beck, and I'm the Executive Director of the Sozosei Foundation. We were launched in 2019 by Otsuka, a global healthcare company. We're here today co-hosting with our grantee partner Tradeoffs. If you don't know, and I hope you do, but if you don't, Tradeoffs is one of the nation's leading healthcare policy podcasts, and I hope that you will be inspired after you hear from Ryan Levi, our moderator, who's a producer at Tradeoffs, to go forward and download this wonderful, helpful resource. So, the Sozosei Foundation, and the word Sozosei means creativity in Japanese. Our mission is to be a catalyst for ideas that nurture creative solutions for healthier communities. And our current focus is on decriminalizing mental illness, which for us means increasing access to healthcare in communities so that folks don't receive their first diagnosis or treatment for mental illness while in jail or prison. Our topic for today is, of course, to hear from the three wonderful editors of their new book, Entangled. Entangled will take us all on a journey through low-level offenses and what happens to people who get caught up in the low-level offense part of our criminal legal system who have mental illness. As I mentioned, Ryan Levi will be moderating this conversation with Doctors Compton, Pope, and Watson as our talented and brilliant speakers. At the end of the event, we'll leave some time open for Q&A, and I hope you will participate vibrantly in that portion of today's presentation. So quickly for some housekeeping, everyone on the webinar will be muted. I hope that you'll place those questions in the Q&A area on Zoom. Take a minute right now in chat and please introduce yourself with your name and your organizational affiliation. Again, we're so glad that so many people could join us today. We'd love to know who's out there with us. You'll see a slide at the end when I'll come back on after this discussion that will have a QR code. We hope you'll share your thoughts with us in a survey. You'll also get that link in an email after the event, which is being recorded. It will be on our website in a couple of days. Should you suffer any technical difficulties during this presentation, please email or text my colleague, Abby Nash. Her number is in the last bullet here on the screen. Take a minute to take a picture of that number or scribble it down, but we think you're going to have a very pleasant and wonderful journey with our great speakers today. And I will turn it over now to Ryan, who will lead us through this dynamic conversation. Ryan?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. So excited to be here with Sozosei and with our incredible panelists and all of you here joining us. This is a really exciting, really important topic and a really interesting book that I'm excited for us to dive into. As Melissa said, my name is Ryan Levi. I am a reporter and producer with Tradeoffs. Tradeoffs covers health policy and our flagship podcast, also called Tradeoffs, drops new episodes every Thursday. So as very much appreciate Melissa's shout out, and also we'll echo that and encourage you to check that out. Tradeoffs.org or wherever you get your podcast is where you can find that. I've been lucky enough to do a lot of reporting with our panelists today over the last few years in talking about mental health and alternative crisis response and the intersection of criminal justice and healthcare. And so really excited to be here with them to talk with all of you about this great book that they have put together. So before we dive in, I'm going to ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves.
Thank you so much, Melissa and Ryan. We're delighted to be with everyone this morning. My name is Michael Compton. I'm a research psychiatrist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, which is a large research institution that's part of the New York State Office of Mental Health, which is the state's mental health authority. I'm also a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University. I started my career as a schizophrenia researcher, but most of my work nowadays relates to criminal justice involvement among people with serious mental illnesses. And I would just add that I'm also very interested in the social determinants of mental health, which tie in prominently to the issue that we're discussing this afternoon.
Great.
Hi, everybody.
Go ahead, Amy.
Sorry. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Watson. I am a professor in the School of Social Work at Wayne State University. Trained as a mental health services researcher and a social worker. I've been doing work at this intersection of serious mental illness in the criminal legal system for about 25 years, much of it with my colleagues, Michael Compton and Leah Pope, but really looking at how to address people's needs that become entangled in the system, but more and more how to help people stay out of the system or never enter. Early in my career, I was a probation officer on a mental health specialty team, which is something that's really helped kind of guide my interest as well as the questions that I ask and the work that I do. And I'll pass it to Leah now.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Leah Pope. I'm an associate professor in the psychiatry department at Columbia University and also a research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Prior to joining Columbia, I was at the Vera Institute of Justice for about 5 years, where I led training and technical assistance in the intersection of police and mental health response. And I'm also an anthropologist by training, so I bring expertise in qualitative methods to our multidisciplinary team. And that's just one thing I wanted to highlight about our team coming from different disciplines really led to the creation of this book. And we're also have our other co-editor, Jennifer Wood at Temple University, who's a criminologist. So among the four of us, psychiatry, social work, anthropology, and criminology, which really informs how this book came together.
Excellent. Yeah, and you can tell when you dig into it, there is y'all really tackle this topic from a lot of different angles, and I think comes together into a really rich work that I'm excited for us to dive into. As Melissa mentioned, so we're gonna have a great conversation here. I've got lots of questions for our panelists. We also want to know the questions that y'all have. So please, as this conversation is going, please put questions in the chat, in the Q&A. And we will have a time at the end where we will get to as many of those as we can. But to kind of start things off, actually, before we get into the book itself, I want to start with the cover. For those who have not, well, let's see, this is the blurred problem, but you can see a little bit of the cover here. And I know there's an interesting story behind the cover. And so, Leah, I want to start with you and ask, can you kind of tell us about the cover?
Thanks for asking that question. So one of the great things about working with Melissa and the team at Sozosei Foundation is that they've been able to connect us to lots of different people in the field who work at this intersection of mental health and criminal justice, and including people who focus on the arts. And so for this project, they actually helped connect us to a group called the Returning Artists Guild, which is a group that was founded in 2018 by two women after their respective releases from prison. And those women, whose names are Amy Wisman and Kanisha Thomas, really wanted to create a space back in the community for therapeutic and creative arts for people who are both currently incarcerated and had previously been incarcerated. So they currently work in community in Ohio, and provide a lot of peer-driven support. And for this book cover, they connected us to one of their artists, a woman named Joy Hoop, who's currently incarcerated in Ohio. And Joy works with materials she finds in prison to create all of her art. And so the photo on the book cover is actually a photograph of one of her sculptures that was created using different materials from the prison. And we were just all, as editors, fascinated by what she's able to create in such a bleak environment. And the particular image we chose to us really evoked this feeling of entanglement because it has a lot of fabric and string sort of tightly wound together. So we were really grateful that she allowed us to use her art to represent our cover.
That's awesome. Yeah, it definitely is you definitely get the sense of that entanglement in a really powerful way from that. And I love that background. That's incredible. So let's turn the cover, we shall say, and get into the book itself. As kind of we've been talking about so far, this book, called Entangled, is really about what happens when people with serious mental illness are arrested for misdemeanor offenses. So things like trespassing, shoplifting, resisting arrest. I want to do a bit of table setting to make sure we're kind of all on the same page as we dive into this conversation. So, Michael, can you help us by defining first what a serious mental illness is and explain why you focused on misdemeanors in this book?
Sure. And Ryan, thank you for this question. Just so that we're all, as you say, on the same page, the National Institute of Mental Health defines SMI, or serious mental illness, as a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that results in serious functional impairment, significantly impacting one or more major life activities. So that's like work or school or relationships. So SMI is really an umbrella term for a persisting psychiatric condition. It's both a diagnosis, like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but it's also a degree of functional impairment. And so compared to people with more minor or less disabling psychiatric disorders, those with SMI are at high risk of police interactions and arrest, largely by virtue of their psychosocial circumstances or their social vulnerabilities. Most of the charges that individuals with SMI get arrested for and jailed for relate to being in the wrong place at the wrong time, like criminal trespass, or having poor interactions with police, like willful obstruction of a law enforcement officer, or even just having difficulties keeping appointments, which we know our clients with SMI have. This can result in charges like failure to appear to court and probation violations. And it's arrests for these types of charges that really interfere with recovery and set the stage for entanglement in the misdemeanor system. So we really wanted to focus our work specifically on misdemeanors, especially given that the vast majority of charges among people with serious mental illnesses are for misdemeanors rather than felonies.
And what we see too, once people become arrested, that it's not just a minor arrest, that it's no big deal. It tends to have cascading consequences, particularly for people with serious mental illnesses and limited resources. I saw this a lot when I was a probation officer working with clients with serious mental illness. They may have a minor arrest that they're on probation for. There's court dates that are required. There's various things that they have to do, and they may miss their court date. Where I worked, the county misdemeanor court was at 8:30 a.m. at a courthouse that there wasn't much public transportation to. So people miss court dates, warrants were issued. Eventually, they would be picked up on a warrant, and sometimes during that process, they'd pick up a new charge. Oftentimes, if they weren't entirely cooperative, they'd get an obstructing charge or an assault on a police officer if they resisted it in any way. This would kind of set up some new probation conditions and more court dates and more opportunities then to get warrants and repeat this cycle. They also, given this process, as things move forward, it made it very difficult for them to maintain their housing if they were in and out of jail, maintain their benefits, their social support networks, and their services that they were engaged with. And of course, what we saw sometimes too is now that you have someone that may have an assault on a police officer charge and a multiple misdemeanor charges, a lot of providers weren't comfortable working with them because we're now talking about someone with a violent criminal history. And it may have just started with a very minor misdemeanor, disorderly conduct, some possession of marijuana charge, but it just cascades in over time. And I think this is something that we saw in the data and talk about in the book, is we saw that the charges people had changed and shifted to be a lot more around violations of probation, trespassing, a lot of things that were related to just their involvement in the system itself.
And I'm jumping ahead a little bit to as I'm watching the chat and seeing everyone introduce themselves and starting to put some questions in there. Abigail was asking if we have data in terms of how many charges. Michael, you talked about that the vast majority of charges for people with serious mental illness are for misdemeanors. I know it was mentioned in the book. I have a number in my head, but I'm afraid of it being the wrong number. So do any of you have that off the top of your head in terms of how big of a proportion we're talking in terms of people with serious mental illness are being arrested for misdemeanors?
Well, I would start by saying that we know that in the US, there are about 10 million arrests each year, and over 80% of those are for misdemeanors. We have some reason to believe that among people with serious mental illnesses, the proportion of misdemeanors to felonies might actually be slightly higher than in the general population.
Got it. So when you're talking about a vast majority, that you're really this is 80% and upwards of folks we're talking about at this kind of intersection of serious mental illness and misdemeanor, which and then the cascading effects that you're talking about, Amy, of how that kind of seemingly minor offense can really snowball and have a deep impact on people's lives. And that's really one of the things that I most appreciated about the book is as we kind of talked about earlier with the y'all's kind of varied backgrounds and academic backgrounds and trainings, this book is built on a combination of quantitative and qualitative research. So in addition to digging into the data that you're citing there, Michael, you also talked with real people with serious mental illness who have been entangled in the legal system. And Leah, I'm wondering if you can tell us the story of one of those people that you talked with, just to help us put a face to what this looks like for someone to go through kind of what Amy and Michael have set up here.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, just to set the stage, as you mentioned, Ryan, we took two approaches in this book. We started with quantitative data to really understand what are the charges that people with serious mental illness are frequently or more likely to be arrested for. We had two studies that looked at that, and that really enabled us to hone in on the charges that are featured in this book, things like criminal trespassing, willful obstruction, shoplifting. And then we did in-depth work in Atlanta, Chicago, Manhattan, and Philadelphia. And the idea was really to talk to people with mental illnesses who have been arrested, as well as system stakeholders, public defenders, district attorneys, police officers, mental health providers, to really get a better sense of how do people get arrested, what's happening, how do they move through the system. And so we do have a series of interviews with people themselves. And I want to share two brief stories because I think they speak to sort of different paths of entanglement. The first story is one we heard so many times, and it's related to criminal trespassing among someone who has a mental illness and is also homeless. So in this example, a man that we call Mr. Thompson in the book was homeless and spent a lot of time outside a local donut shop in Atlanta. And over time, his use of the space outside the donut shop caused sort of increasing concern. And often anger among patrons, the store manager, other business owners in the area. And so the store owners started calling 911 several times. And what would happen is the police would come, they'd ask Mr. Thompson to move, he would leave, only to return a few hours later. And it was a tricky case because the police officers actually knew Mr. Thompson quite well, which is often the case in community policing initiatives. And they knew he didn't pose a threat to public safety. At times, they even encouraged him to go to a shelter. But eventually, the business owner had enough and insisted that they make an arrest for criminal trespassing. And so at that point, the police, their hand was sort of forced, and they did make an arrest, and they brought Mr. Thompson to jail. And so he had to spend time in jail while the case got resolved. And actually, the district attorney eventually threw the case out. Um, and, but at that point, he had already been arrested, already had the police contact, the negative consequences of, spending time in jail. And this was a story we heard time and again. And I think it really highlights two important points. First, it speaks to the role that police play in brokering the use of public space and how there are often competing demands on how space is used, often legitimate demands. But police have to broker different stakeholders in the community. And then the second is that really highlights the role of discretion in a lot of police decision making around low-level crimes. So in this case, as I mentioned, the police had come multiple times and not made an arrest. And then in this final case, they did make an arrest. And so police officers really have to repeatedly decide when it's prudent to make an arrest, and when it's just as effective or not more effective to handle the matter informally. And I think that dynamic comes into play repeatedly around these low-level crimes. So, and then a second story briefly is very different, and it starts with a case of shoplifting. We interviewed a woman named Miss George, who was 31 years old, and she was living in a hotel with her children at the time that we interviewed her. And her first arrest ever, she described to us, was for shoplifting an item that was about $25 from the local bargain store in her neighborhood. And as it turned out, the store had a policy where any item more than $25 was automatically, the store would press charges. And that's actually quite common in bigger stores across the country. And so they arrested Miss George, and she spent a day in jail before being bailed out. And, this would have potentially been a relatively minor interaction with the system. Shoplifting is, one of the most common crimes in the United States across all groups of people. But she subsequently missed a court date. So Amy and Michael have both mentioned missing court dates. And what happened when she missed a court date? Well, a warrant was put out for her arrest, unbeknownst to her. And this is what happens: warrants get put out. And then a couple months later, she gets in an altercation with her ex-husband, and the ex-husband calls the police. When the police show up, they realize she has a warrant. They arrest her. She goes to jail. So now she's in jail for the shoplifting charge and the failure to appear. She ended up spending about 4 months in jail before agreeing to probation. She was put on probation. She subsequently failed one of the terms of her probation by missing an appointment with her probation officer, and was returned to jail. And so it ended up being about 5.5 months in jail, from something that really started with this low-level shoplifting and then sort of snowballed, as we're talking about, into a much more serious interaction, and quite long interaction with the criminal legal system.
And I know this is something that y'all get into in the book as well, that you're touching on here, Leah, is this kind of these different stakeholders. You talk about the police having a lot of discretion and a lot of choices to make kind of in these daily decisions. Some folks in chat also talking about prosecutors also having roles. And I know in some of the reporting that I did in Durham, North Carolina, around their alternative crisis response program, we heard a lot of similar things where criminal trespass is like the biggest thing they see. They have Durham has, unlike some cities, they have, instead of cops being sent out to that, when possible, they send these alternative responders who are social workers, peers, and an EMT, and they try to kind of diffuse the situation and not have police involved. But that is the situation where, as exactly as you're saying with Mr. Thompson, you have the business owners who are really invested in having people moved more permanently away from their space. But even when police do get involved, we were told repeatedly that, police get involved, they make an arrest because the business owners want them to, but the local prosecutors had a policy of not prosecuting those kinds of offenses. And so people would spend 12, 24 hours in jail and then be released, and often end up back in front of whatever business, but also having had all of the kind of potential for cascading consequences you're talking about. So I know there are kind of lots of pieces there that I know y'all dig into the book more. Maybe we'll talk more later on. But yeah, that kind of the
Yeah.
choices that different people can make. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add that, I think what you're saying points to one of the things we do in the book is try to trace the history of each of these charges to a certain extent, to show how charges and the use of charges changes over time. So criminal trespassing is one really good example of how came into existence and then sort of transformed in use over time. And now many jurisdictions, they don't prosecute criminal trespassing in nearly the same way. In others, they do. And so just thinking about how larger social forces also impact sort of what charges are used and what happens once someone's arrested on them.
And so you spend a lot of time talking in the book about potential solutions to the problems that you've identified and kind of the concerns, someone having these issues where people have serious mental illness and they are finding themselves in these situations, getting entangled, having these these minor offense arrests, and getting caught in this system that can have these, cascading consequences. You spend a lot of time talking about potential solutions to this problem. We've already hit on a couple of them in terms of, alternative crisis response, prosecutorial discretion. But I want to kind of dig in more to solutions because I think everyone here, I'm sure, is hungry for solutions to how we can address this. And so, Amy, I'm wondering if you can walk us through 2 to 3 of the most promising solutions that you all chronicle in the book. What is the solution and what does the evidence say about its effectiveness?
Sure. I mean, if I had to pick two, I would pick 911 diversion to some type of alternative response and housing first programs. So, as you mentioned, the Durham program, which is an alternative response program, these are teams oftentimes of some type of behavioral health professional, sometimes an EMT or a certified peer that respond directly to 911 calls without police. Some teams focus primarily on behavioral health calls. Some teams have a broader net in terms of what they'll go to, including some conflict resolution and some other types of calls. Overall, I think the Policing Project estimates there's about 130 alternative response programs in the US right now. Another thing that some communities are doing is diverting 911 calls that are mental health related directly to mobile crisis teams for response. And those are typically a little bit narrow in terms of the type of calls they go to, but in effect, you have, for both of these types of programs, a response that doesn't include police officers with the authority to arrest or use force. But they do have a skill set that can help address the situation and get people connected to resources. And I think this is kind of a new field. Mobile crisis has been around for a while, but there's surprisingly very limited research on the impact of mobile crisis teams, and alternative responder teams are really, we're seeing kind of that explosion in the past 5 years. And so far, the research is limited, but there are two peer-reviewed published studies. One that I found, one is of the Denver Star program, which was a program that had teams of a behavioral health professional, either bachelor's or master's level, and an EMT or paramedic going to low-level calls, including mental health crisis, trespassing, those types of calls. And the study found that in the first 6 months of operation, they saw about a decrease of about a third of misdemeanor crimes reported. You have to understand a little bit. A crime was reported if a police officer went out and documented it as a misdemeanor crime. So by not sending police, you weren't identifying the situation as a criminal situation, but they were sending somebody that could address the situation. Of course, we need additional research to see if this actually results in a reduction in subsequent just calls for some type of service for those situations. But it really is starting to add to what we're kind of supporting that these programs can have an impact on reducing criminalization. The other study is a recently published evaluation of the CAHOOTS program in Eugene and Springfield, Oregon. That was led by Jonathan Davis. And what they found was that CAHOOTS did result in reductions of arrests in those immediate encounters, so lower risk of arrest. They also saw increases in access to medical services and other city services. They also saw a decrease in the likelihood of calls to the same address in the weeks following. So again, this is kind of starting to show some evidence that these programs really can reduce people's contact with the criminal legal system and get them connected to care. We really do need to continue to collect data on these programs so that we can document how they're operating. And I see somebody's comment in the chat that Cahoots is no longer operating in Eugene, but they are operating, I believe, still in Springfield, is my understanding. But it is showing some evidence that these programs can have an impact on getting a response out to calls. And Cahoots goes to calls that may be a behavioral health crisis, but also those criminal trespass calls. So a business owner may call because somebody they don't want in their business or in front of their business is causing a problem. Some of those situations that might not be called an acute psychiatric crisis, but are a situation where someone is at risk of being arrested and starting this cascading kind of entanglement in the criminal legal system. So that's kind of, kind of where we're at with research on these community responder programs. The other intervention that I think is something that we really need to continue to look at and push for more of is housing first programs, which really come from the philosophy of prioritizing permanent housing for people that are unhoused, without having requirements that people stay sober, that they engage in services, but services are offered. And there's been some systematic reviews of existing housing first programs that point to effectiveness in reducing criminal legal system involvement, increasing housing stability. There's also, particularly when mental health support is added in, we're seeing that people have fewer arrests compared to people that have just the support but not the housing program. And there was another study, a recent one in 2022, that suggested that the likelihood of arrest actually continues to decrease the longer somebody is housed in one of these programs. And again, I think this goes at really kind of addressing some social determinants and addressing some folks' basic needs to help them stay stable in the community can be very protective in terms of reducing their contact with the criminal legal system. So I think these are two of the promising ones. There's other exciting and innovative work going on around the country. So there's a lot of other things, but those are the two that I think are the most promising.
Thank you for that, Amy. And I'm looking in the Q&A and Justin has a question which I'm going to toss in here because Justin notes that seemingly, and they'll correct us if we're wrong, neither of those would necessarily have made an impact for the second story on Ms. George that you shared, Leah, where that incident starts with shoplifting. And I'm curious if Amy or Michael or Leah, if y'all could share one of the solutions or kind of innovations that's happening around the country that would that might kind of intervene or have an impact in her story that starts with a shoplifting, which is a little bit of a different situation than a criminal trespass type setup.
I would actually argue that an alternative response team could be utilized in a minor shoplifting case. Is Denver Star goes to some low-level types of calls. I also think that the presence of some of these teams in communities, they often will work with the business community and kind of negotiate, being called for some of these situations so that they can go out and try to address a problem without involving police, particularly for really low level. So I would argue that could be relevant here. But there's also other types of programs that may be very useful here as well. I don't know if Leah or Michael want to jump in or.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think that there are some interesting examples across the country where business owners or stores are actually trying to do some problem solving internally to and or in collaboration with their local police departments to better understand how they can themselves solve problems informally potentially. And I think that has promise as well, instead of repeated calls to police, which ties up resources. I also think, to Amy's point, though, once an arrest has happened, then to Justin's question, there were so many other points of intervention that could have happened after. I'm particularly interested in thinking about, are there better ways to support people with mental illnesses around appearing in court on time. Because we know that there are low-level interventions to increase court appearance rates that have been tried and tested in other jurisdictions. And I think we've been talking a lot about, does it make sense to think about even something that's a little more tailored to people with mental illnesses who may very well forget appointments or have social circumstances that prevent them from getting to court. And you just think how big a difference that could make, even if the initial arrest can't be avoided.
We also talked to, in some of our focus groups, there are some deferred prosecution programs for low-level misdemeanors as well that at least limit the amount of time people are involved in the system. And of course, they can avoid having a conviction on their record. So there's some, as people move a little bit further into the system, there's opportunities to off-ramp them. And as Leah indicated, to also recognize and make sure that they're not being penalized for just missing some requirements that don't necessarily impact public safety in any way, and supporting them in being able to get through whatever it is that's required of them within the system.
And Monica in the chat is also raising a good point that shoplifting is often due to folks trying to meet their fundamental needs. And I know Monica is calling out the Cambridge Heart Alternative Response Program. I know Durham Heart does this as well, often provides some of those needs. You can come in for sweatpants, a sweatshirt, some, small food items, a tent, things like that. That can kind of try to hit off some of those basic needs that people might otherwise need to resort to shoplifting as well. So I think thank you, Monica, for making that point. I think that's a great one as well. So that's kind of, we kind of actually got into my next question a little bit early with that, which, kind of looking at how some of these, or maybe actually even like let's play out this idea of you looking at these solutions. We kind of talked about how, there might be these different off ramps that Ms. George could have had with some of these programs to either, maybe help meet some needs initially, help work with the business so that they are not looking to have that policy of you have automatically pressing charges, or trying to help her get to her court appearances on time and not kind of continue this cascade. So then I want to go to Mr. Thompson, the other gentleman that Leah told us about earlier, who had the criminal trespass experience. And Michael, I'm curious if you can kind of walk us through how his story may have looked different if there was a alternative response program in his community that he could have had access to and that could have been used for him. How might his story have looked different if that option was around?
Yes, thank you, Ryan. I guess, thinking about this at the 10,000-foot level first. First of all, mental illness is not a crime, right? Our goal here is to decriminalize mental illness. And in my view, that really requires at least three approaches. We need research, we need programs, and we need policy change. And so just real quick to get back to research, I want to point out a study that we did here in New York State where we looked at all arrests from 2010 to 2013. And I just want to give a statistic, and that is that among people with a serious mental illness, 7.3% of their charges were for violent offenses, meaning that 93% were for nonviolent offenses. So I just want to, again, reiterate the magnitude of the issue at hand when we're talking about criminalization. So we need research, we need programs, we need policy change. With regard to Mr. Thompson, yes, the discussion has been rich so far. If an alternative responder program could have gone out and mediated the situation between Mr. Thompson and the donut shop business owner, then the outcome would be obvious. He would be able to hopefully once again focus on his treatment and his recovery, rather than having to focus on the criminal justice system and all of the requirements that he then has in that system. So we need programs like alternative responder programs, but we also need policy change. A few examples have already been pointed out: progressive prosecution, deferred prosecution, but also things like bail reform. So in New York State, a few years ago, the General Assembly passed bail reform, meaning that for many, if not most, misdemeanor charges, judges are no longer allowed to hold people in pretrial detention. And so that's a policy change that reduces criminalization, because it means that you're not serving time pretrial for weeks, months, et cetera, before even, going before a judge and being sentenced. So that's an example of, a policy change at the state level that could be helpful. But with, bail reform comes, problems that also need to be addressed. So for example, the problem of failure to appear. If you're not held in pretrial detention, you're commonly given a desk appearance ticket, meaning that you're given an appointment to come back to court. And so we saw in the case of Miss George that was the very issue. Yes, she had a shoplifting charge, but the real problem was that she missed an appointment. So she had a failure to appear charge and therefore a bench warrant that was eventually executed. So, we need policy change with regard to issues like failure to appear. Courts need to take new progressive approaches to help all clients, but especially those with serious mental illnesses, be able to keep their appointments and then have leniency when they miss an appointment, because we know that our clients struggle with a lot of psychosocial circumstances that make it difficult to keep appointments. So again, another example of policy change. We need all three of these approaches to decriminalize mental illness: research, programs at the local level, and policy change at the local level, but ideally at the state level. So that, again, Miss George would be able to focus hopefully on her treatment and her recovery, rather than dealing with yet another charge and yet another stay in jail.
And I really appreciate that, Michael. And I think one of the things that comes to mind for me when you talk about that, hopefully giving her or Mr. Thompson that opportunity to focus on their recovery or focus on their treatment, is that just like we talked about, there are, various actors kind of on the criminal legal side of deciding, how criminalized someone is in an instance. There's also a lot of actors beyond these, alternative responders programs, whoever, to actually make sure that people can get that treatment. Just because someone is deferred from criminalization does not guarantee that they will have access to treatment or housing or the other things they need to actually kind of break that cycle. I'm curious if there are any either programs or policies that y'all either talk about in the book or that are just you're aware of more broadly that you think are most promising at that piece, at actually making sure that there is the access to that treatment and those pieces that allow people, if they are not criminalized, to kind of make progress in managing their serious mental illness. Because I know in Durham that, in the reporting we did, that's been one of the most difficult pieces, is the diversion from criminalization. Actually, these programs, as Amy has discussed, has been relatively successful in a lot of places, but being able to make that connection and actually break that cycle, that seems to be one of the an even trickier piece. So I'm curious what bright spots y'all have seen there.
Yeah, I would let Amy and Leah chime in, but when I say programs, I just want to emphasize that I mean programs within public safety, programs within law enforcement, but as you point out, Ryan, also programs within the mental health system. So we need all of these types of programs, and also in other social sectors, programs in housing, in food access and food security, et cetera. And I know that it's been pointed out a couple of times in the chat about AOT. Yes, maybe that's a program that's going to be beneficial, but we need a full array of programs to meet people where they are, to meet their needs in terms of their, psychiatric needs, but also their social needs.
And Michael or whoever wants to take this just briefly, because I have also seen that coming up in the chat. Do one of you all mind just really briefly giving a quick definition explanation of AOT for folks who may not be familiar?
So AOT is assisted outpatient treatment. It's a civil court order for someone and basically most AOT programs package it with a comprehensive array of services. So there's providers that are also accountable for making sure that they provide services for the person. So it's a civil court process. Sometimes some states use it for people leaving the hospital. Some states also use it just for people that may meet criteria for civil commitment, but can be served in the community on a civil court order. And I think one of the things with AOT is that and many times it's talked about in this way, is that it holds the service system accountable for providing care for the person. And I think we need to make sure that regardless of someone has done an AOT order or not, that we're holding the service system accountable for providing care and being accessible. And that requires us to resource that service system to be able to do that and to be able to make sure that they're doing engagement, that they're working with folks and meeting them where they're at. They're able to help access housing for people. So it really is a comprehensive array of services that we need to make sure is available for folks with serious mental illness in the community as a way of, and if they have access to that, oftentimes they're going to be less vulnerable to having those interactions with the criminal legal system, whether it's with an AOT order or without the AOT order.
Awesome. Thank you. And then going back to the question before that, which I think you kind of touched on, because it sounds like there's kind of some provider, there's some trying to kind of connect folks to providers with AOT as well, but kind of what are their bright spots? Are there programs that either have evidence, or anecdotal signs of success that are able to not just divert people from criminalization, but actually help them make progress on treatment and management of their serious mental illness in a way that can help them avoid those situations in the future?
Assertive community treatment is an evidence-based model for providing services for people with serious mental illness that are at risk for hospitalization, repeated hospitalizations, or repeated criminal legal system involvement. And it's a team approach that provides in the community care for people with pretty high needs. And there's quite a bit of research on ACT. There's also some research on a version of ACT that's FACT, forensic assertive community treatment, for folks that are involved in the criminal legal system. So that's one model. And what we see is that many mental health systems offer this, but there's limited slots for people to get access to that level of care. It's a more expensive level of care, but it also, there's quite a bit of evidence that it can be really helpful for stabilizing people in the community.
Excellent. One thing as I was reading the book, and I feel like it's already kind of come up a little bit in the chat, and even the mention of cahoots and kind of the pulling back on the services there. Reading this book today in 2025 felt very different than it would have, I think, reading it 2 or 3 years ago. There was, I think, as all of us know, there was this period post the murder of George Floyd where there seemed to be a lot of momentum, especially in large cities, but not just in large cities, to pull back on law enforcement, on enforcement of some misdemeanors. I'm thinking of cities that decriminalized drug possession, elected, Michael talked about this earlier, progressive prosecutors who campaigned and were elected on reducing incarceration for low-level offenses. And there was a lot of support for these ideas within the Biden administration. Now, lawmakers in Oregon have recriminalized drug possession. Voters in LA, San Francisco, and Oakland have recalled their progressive district attorneys. So kind of without all this preamble, Leah, I want to start with you here. What do you say to people who say, look, all these things you're talking about, decriminalizing mental illness and making some of these changes, we tried it and it didn't work. What do you say to folks who may be thinking that? Oh, it looks like you may be muted, Leah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. I was just sort of chuckling to myself when no one could hear me, saying that the question itself sort of bothers me. I just don't think it's valid to say that these programs are not working yet when we just recently started investing in this type of work and implementing them. So I would caution and say, first, this is very early days experimenting with alternatives to police for people with mental illness. But if I entertain the question a little more seriously, I guess I would ask someone who says it's not working, what's not working and why isn't it working? And also who says it's not working? And asking those sorts of questions would really let us zero in on some of the more important elements in this conversation, things like how is the program or the approach being implemented? How are we defining and measuring success? Things like what measures of or metrics of public safety matter to the community. And so, we, as a team, we've talked a lot about the importance of, as we stand up these programs, also ensuring that we evaluate them and really be able to track what they are able to achieve. Because, of course, not everything works. And we have to be prepared to admit if programs don't work going down the road. But I'm still convinced that there are a lot of communities in both blue and red states that want to develop these alternatives. And I really don't think that's going away regardless of politics. I think there's a lot of momentum.
And I know I really think that kind of that metric of like what are we measuring? What is the metric of success? I think is such a important one because I know, talking to tough folks around the country on this, one of those clear metrics of success is, I think this goes back to what we were just talking about, like one clear metric of success is diverting people from criminalization and from involvement in the legal system. And that has seemed to be very successful. But again, there are, as we talked about the business owners, the donut shop owner, there are folks who are not interested in that. And there are a lot, and they see the legal system as the solution. And then even if kind of folks agree that there is that metric of success of like, we agree we want to decriminalize folks and help them avoid that, actually taking that next step and helping them get into the treatment that they need, so they're not kind of stuck in this cycle is that next success. And how do you think about a program that may, this is just coming, I'm curious, this is an off the cuff thought, but I'm curious if anyone has thoughts, how do you think about a program that is successful at diverting people from criminalization, diverting people with serious mental illness from criminalization, but maybe doesn't show that it is effective at improving treatment adherence or whatever other measures we might say that could say, oh, someone's actually getting better and able to get more help at managing their serious mental illness. Is that a program that still has value because it's at least making that first step of diverting people from the criminal legal system?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I would argue that, yes, the program still has value if your goal is to reduce contact for people with mental illness in the criminal justice system. And I think we don't want to be happy with that alone, right? Ultimately, we should be promoting recovery and, thriving in the community. And that requires long-term investment and sticking with people. And if we want to know if that's happening, we also have to research it over time, right? So it's not enough to just say, Mr. Thompson didn't get arrested. We want to be able to track Mr. Thompson over time. And those studies are harder to do just because they cost a lot of money. But I think it's really important that we don't just focus on the reduction of criminal justice involvement, but that we also focus on, helping people live meaningful and productive lives.
And so I know there are people in this audience who it is very clear from the chat and I think from their attendance here today that they really are committed to rethinking how the legal system treats people with serious mental illness. Amy, I'll send this one to you. What advice do you have for them about how to try to continue studying and pushing for these types of policies and innovative solutions at a time when the wind may not be at their back like it has been in previous years?
So I would say right now the federal wind may not be at their back, but a lot of this work happens at the state and community level. So there's still plenty of work to continue doing. There's states that are really interested in moving forward with policies that reduce the footprint of the criminal legal system, as well as policies that expand access to behavioral health care. So I think it's really important to think about where we're focusing our efforts, but then making sure that as we're operating the programs that exist or new ones that are coming online, that these programs are partnering with researchers that can help ensure that they're collecting the data that they need to show what is the impact of the program, as well as some of that process evaluation piece as well, because sometimes things don't go as planned. If you have been collecting data along the way, it's easier to identify kind of what went wrong and what can be done to address that. But making sure that we're collecting that data, and I'm an optimist. I think the federal wind will change in the future. And if we have that data, then we'll be able to make a case for also capturing some federal resources to keep these initiatives going. But again, I don't think all is lost at this point. I think there's a lot of really great work going on across the country in communities and states and in red states as well, that will continue because people are invested in it. We just need to make sure that we're doing that research and collecting that data so that we can continue to understand the impact, but also then advocate for the resources that we need going and policies that we need going forward.
All right, I want to move into some more questions that we're getting from the audience. There's some really great ones here. So thank you. And the conversation in general has been awesome as I've been keeping a half an eye on that as well. We've gotten a couple of questions about racial disparities and kind of breaking down some of the topics we've been talking about based on race. What do we know from the data on what kind of the breakdown, if we have any sense of the breakdown, demographic breakdowns by race on the share of people with serious mental illness that are arrested for misdemeanors, caught up in this entangled system? What do we know on that front? Who wants to take a stab?
I can jump in. Yeah. So from our quantitative data, our studies, the same racial disparities appear in our data on looking at people with mental illness and arrests that appear in those without mental illness, right? So Black men are more likely to be arrested for these sorts of crimes. So we definitely see the same patterns, unfortunately. I would say, our book was also very intentionally attuned to thinking about how racial disparities run through this work, and our chapters on the individual charges, as well as the later chapters on reform, take up this issue of racial disparities, and also thinking about, as we build new systems and new approaches, to really ensure that we don't replicate the racial disparities that have resulted from existing programs, right? So, as we're building them, we really need to say and be looking, are these programs serving people equitably? Do people have equitable results when they interact with these approaches, or are there actually racial disparities in either who's being served or what the outcomes are? So we're very, mindful that unfortunately, the same racial disparities exist in this sort of subpopulation, and that we need to be vigilant about ensuring that we're mindful of not replicating them in our new approaches.
And I would just echo that, and I would, say that basically there are two massive societal problems that are overlaid on one another. One is mass incarceration, that especially targets BIPOC communities, and the other is criminalization, which is what we're talking about mostly this afternoon. Those two U.S. societal problems are overlaid, and so they're very much interrelated. And I agree with what Leah said, and I would also add that policies and programs need to be specifically designed to be anti-racist, or else they are likely to continue the, systemic racism that led to the problem of mass incarceration. So we really need to think about anti-racist approaches to research, to programs, and to policy.
And just briefly, I'm curious if any of are there any programs that y'all are aware of that you see bright spots that they have been finding some ways to kind of really be intentional about in these diversion programs, in these alternative response programs, being intentional about trying to tackle some of those disparities that we see in the system?
I would refer you, Ryan, and the audience to a very important chapter in the book that's specifically about this problem.
Excellent. Well, that's your cue, everyone, to make sure you're getting the book as well. We're also getting a lot of questions about involuntary commitment, and kind of from a few different perspectives. And one of them is, I think, kind of at a higher level, looking at I know there are a lot of different views on involuntary commitment, and so I guess looking at kind of in the work that y'all are seeing, how are you seeing involuntary commitment come up and be addressed in some of these attempts to decriminalize mental illness? Because we know that involuntary commitment kind of, in some ways, can kind of fall in between, where it is treatment as opposed to incarceration, but it is not by choice. There's inherently some obviously the involuntary piece of it. So how are you seeing that come up in the work that you've done and in these efforts across the country?
I think something that we see, so I don't think we'll get too far ahead if we think about this as simply shifting things from the criminal legal system to the civil system. I think, certainly there is a place, and there are situations that require civil commitment, be it inpatient or AOT. But if our focus on getting people out of the criminal legal system is simply shifting, we may be missing the opportunity to really think about how do we develop services, comprehensive service systems that meet people's needs and meet them where they're at, and support that with other social services so that people are housed, have access to food. That I think that will improve quality of life for people. It will also help them avoid contact with the criminal legal system. It may also allow people to engage in services that might not previously have been able to or willing to engage in services. So I think if we focus only on shifting things to civil commitment, we may really miss an important opportunity to build systems that meet people's needs. And if they're meeting people's needs up front, many people won't end up in the situation where we're thinking about, should we criminalize this or should we send this through civil court? That people can be early on in their illness, access the things that they need, and be able to stabilize in the community and have a better quality of life.
We have another question from Lee Romney, who is a freelance journalist, and I would actually encourage folks. She just wrote a great piece for Cal Matters about how in some communities in California, the idea of decriminalizing mental illness has been taken, one might say, to an extreme, where there are some sheriff's departments that are refusing to respond to 911 calls involving mental illness. And the story does a really great job of breaking down that decision and how different stakeholders are responding to it and how the impact it's having. So I highly recommend folks check that out. But Lee's question, I think, is a really prescient one and a very relevant one, which is how critical is Medicaid funding to some of the models, particularly the successful models that you all have been talking about today? As we know, Medicaid funding is something that Republicans in Congress have been looking to cut in various ways in their budget process. So I think there's a lot of people who are really thinking about the role of Medicaid and what it funds. And so if y'all could talk a little bit about its role in these types of programs.
Well, I would say that Medicaid is by far, the very largest payer of mental health services in the US. So any cut to Medicaid is going to be a major, major blow to the people who we serve. And that's whether we're talking about ACT or mobile crisis teams or clinic services or day treatment programs, et cetera, et cetera. Medicaid, I don't know the statistics here off the top of my head, but Medicaid is by far the largest payer of services for people with SMI.
And I would say it's a necessary. I mean, it's necessary. We know current levels of Medicaid funding still aren't meeting everybody's needs. Um, we still struggle for resources in the public mental health system. So it's absolutely necessary, and cuts are really going to harm people. I also would say that it's not entirely sufficient because we need to really be thinking about these other services that might not be funded through a Medicaid program. Housing, food access, although there are some innovative things that people are doing in some places for demonstrations with Medicaid that allows for housing to be covered and some food as medicine to be covered. So I think, again, it's absolutely necessary that we maintain Medicaid funding, and we really push for that. We also need to make sure that we're pushing for those additional resources as well.
And I know that I don't have the specific numbers off the top of my head, but I know that also there were several states have also gotten federal approval under the Biden administration to use Medicaid funding for mobile crisis in particular. I know that has been something that as communities have been trying to figure out how to fund this sustainably, that has been something that they've looked to. And I know in kind of our own reporting that there are some folks who are worried, as states if states get big Medicaid cuts, that is something that's kind of on the newer side of a benefit that they've offered, that may be one of the first things that is pulled back. And that combined with other potential cuts outlined in budget proposals, that could also be really a hit on these new programs, these mobile crisis programs that cities are trying to step up. Another question from Piet that comes in here that I've heard a lot during my reporting as well is the issue of transportation and kind of who can transport people. That there are some communities where there is either belief or policy that only police or EMTs are allowed to transport people in certain situations. Can you kind of give us a little bit of sense of the transportation landscape in terms of, when we talk about alternative crisis response programs, are these programs able to transport people if they need to get from the donut shop to a treatment facility, for instance?
Yeah, this is a great question and something we're increasingly interested in. So different states have different policies and laws around transportation. And in some cases, it is required for police to transport a person to an emergency room. And so, to the extent that you want to not include police in your response, but an alternative team goes out and decides that transport to the hospital is necessary, the police will still have to come. So it's tricky in places where those policies exist. In other places, that's not the case. People can transport directly. One thing that's exciting to see is another project we're working on where we've been reading state plan amendments for Medicaid. We've seen that a few states have put in amendments specifically to allow for new types of transportation for crisis response. So it would allow for a different type of vehicle and also a billing for that, the vehicle and the staff time to transport the person. So I think that's an exciting thing to see. A few states have done this, and I think it's sort of a nod to this idea that if we really want to make good on, alternatives to police response, then we really have to solve the transport issue because sometimes people do need to be transported.
I think we've got time for one or two more, and one that's here from Henry is asking about if y'all have looked at the effectiveness of treatment courts and their role in particular with serious mental illness. Treatment courts, I know, is something that's been around for a lot longer than some of the other um, interventions that we've been talking about today. So curious what y'all's research has shown on that, or other research has shown on the effectiveness of those.
So I think there is some evidence for mental health courts for folks that complete mental health programs having lower recidivism rates. I think, some of the concerns with using mental health courts for low-level misdemeanors is that it's a pretty intrusive program with a lot of requirements. So it could create more opportunities to violate conditions for something pretty minor. So I think it's a balance of thinking about the level of service somebody needs and is appropriate, and the level of intrusion that might be warranted by the seriousness of the crime. But again, there are some treatment courts that have shown, that they've had benefits for folks in getting them connected and stable in care and reducing recidivism. But it is a pretty high level of care, and there are a lot of requirements that people have to comply with in order to successfully move through them. So that balance, I think, is really important to consider, that we're not over entangling someone for something really minor when we might be able to connect them to care through a different venue.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank all the panelists, Amy, Leah, Michael. It's been such a great conversation. And I want to encourage folks a quick plug for folks who are continued interested in this space to we at Tradeoffs did a lot of reporting last year on alternative crisis response, specifically in Durham, North Carolina, with their HEART program. That series is called The Fifth Branch. And would encourage folks to check that out if they're interested in particular about alternative crisis response. You can find that and the rest of Tradeoffs work at tradeoffs.org. And with that, I will turn it back over to Melissa.
Thanks so much. I agree. This was an excellent conversation, really thought-provoking. You know, I I think that one of the things that never ceases to amaze me and distress me equally is the humanitarian crisis that we face with the criminalization of mental illness. And the entanglement that has been illuminated here, along with the continued racial disparities and the fact that we live in a pro-carceral society, gives us some pretty significant headwinds. But some of the things that make me feel really optimistic are the work of Doctors Watson, Compton, and Pope, the work of Tradeoffs, and frankly, the really effervescent chat that I had the pleasure of experiencing during this conversation, which makes me feel like the foundation is on the right track, continuing to do these convenings. As I mentioned, you'll be getting an email with a survey. I hope you all will respond. And all of the participants here, as a gift for your participation, will be receiving a copy of the book at the mailing address you provided to us when you registered. Another and my final thought here is, Michael, I want to thank you in particular for giving us this three-pronged framework for how to approach decriminalization. And I want to repeat it again and add three other things to it. Michael, you echoed twice the need for research, the need for great programming, and the need for policy change. And I would add to that that we also need to focus ourselves on creativity. Sozosei means creativity. And I want to just give a shout out to two of our amazing grantees, 1 million madly motivated moms who have created the right response directory, which you can find with a simple Google or going on their website. And the second is the Medical Legal Partnership at the Camden Coalition, which is really trying to work to get lawyers and behavioral health care providers to work together to ensure that folks don't become entangled. So creativity, changing the narrative is my other add-on so that we disrupt the status quo and our comfort level with the criminalization of mental illness. and finally, continuing the work to address the racial disparities that prevail in this country. Again, thank you all so very much. Be on the lookout for your book as a gift. Thank you all for sharing our goal in decriminalizing mental illness, and thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.